After all, the bones of Europeans 500 years ago are much thicker than our bones are. We sit at a computer all day. They had a much more difficult time, having to work with their hands and so forth. Muscularity through time is decreasing. If you go back, it increases. Also, there's good evidence in the fossil record now that some particular Neanderthals that are born, for example, there's a 4-year-old child found in Portugal just a few years ago that has characteristics of both modern Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. That's not an exception. There's other examples of that. This argues strongly that if they're able to interbreed, this is evidence that they are indeed the same species. Well, in recent times, they've done DNA tests on at least a couple of Neanderthal specimens, and they're in the process of mapping Neanderthal, the genome, finding out what the particular place of all the genes are. When they compared the couple of Neanderthals that they've taken DNA from with modern Homo sapiens, they've noted some differences. So the evolutionists have interpreted this as there being two different species. However, there's a number of ways that this can be explained. I would expect some differences between modern Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. First of all, Neanderthals were completely isolated, in many cases, in Western Europe by glaciers and so forth. And so the gene flow would be significantly reduced. So you would get things like bottlenecks and genetic drift and so forth that may account for some of those differences. Nonetheless, there is overlap between the two genetic codes enough that to this date I still would strongly argue that Neanderthals are human beings. Now let's look at some of the new players. We're just getting towards the end here, but let's look at some of the new players. Here you see an example of Ida, which was found recently, and it was thought to be a primate intermediate form. When I looked at this, I said, what you used to see those commercials, not that I drink or anything, but I said, oh, it's Miller time. That means it's over, okay? It doesn't mean drink, it means it's over. Because when I looked at this, I said, what? That's supposed to be an intermediate form? That looks almost identical to modern-day lemurs. Well, as it turns out, there's only a few minor variational differences between Ida and modern-day lemurs. For example, there's a couple of differences in the teeth and in the claws. But variational differences, that's at the same level of complexity. That does not denote an intermediate form. What was Ida is simply an extinct primate, probably a member of the lemur family, not a good example of an intermediate form, at least in my opinion. Now here's one that's been in the news a lot, Ardipithecus ramidus. Even in the video that you watched today, this was mentioned. It's affectionately called Artie. They always give nicknames, Lucy, Artie, and so forth, to make them more human-like, I suspect. But what's interesting about this particular specimen, it's highly fragmentary, found over in Ethiopia a number of years ago, and look at the reconstruction of the limb bones. Now, when you see great apes, they have the same hands and feet. You have opposable thumbs on your hands like this. Okay, if you took your shoes off right now, I don't think you'd find the same thing. Hopefully you wouldn't. You do not have an opposable grasping thumb on your feet. But guess what? Artie did. Ardipithecus is not related to human beings. It obviously spent a lot of time up in the trees brachiating like the limbs of chimpanzees. Here you can see a comparison between the foot of humans and chimps. Artie's hands and feet very much like chimps, not like humans. The cranial capacity very small, not related to humans again. I have to put a big X through this candidate. It has failed the test of diagnostic characteristics. And another one that's been in the news, not too many years, but in recent times, Kenanthropus platyops, the plate or flat-plated man from Kenya. Very flat face, small face, thought to have lived about the same time as certain Australopithecines like Lucy. And notice a very flat face, very ape-like, not a good candidate. There's really no characteristics that I know of in Kenyanthropus that I would say are some kind of intermediate. I realize I'm biased, but I do look at these closely and say, okay, from an evolutionary perspective, because I was trained by evolutionists, does this look like a good candidate for an intermediate? Do they have any kind of a case? No, absolutely not. There's nothing about this anatomy that denotes an intermediate form that is human-like at all. There's everything that denotes a fossil great ape. Not like modern apes, but nonetheless an extinct variety of ape. Well, I want to point out the track record of evolutionists, not to make fun of them, but just to let you know they've constantly made mistakes. Now, creationists make mistakes too. But what's important is each particular fossil that the evolutionists find, they say this documents the fact of evolution. And entire generations are growing up thinking, oh, there's Piltdown Man. That proves that there's an ape-like ancestor. Of course, this was discovered as a complete fraud and determined that it was a compilation of not just different bones, but an entire compilation of different species. Part human bones, part orang, not related to human origins. And then, of course, the famous Nebraska Man found from a particular tooth. It turned out to be an extinct peccary. A peccary is said to be a variety of pig. So I like to say this is one case where evolution made a pig out to be a man and the pig made a monkey out of evolution. In fact, I have a friend who's renamed that a number of years ago. He calls it Homo pigus. Now, this was one I discovered during the course of my graduate work. It's called Pithecanthropus 4. Keep in mind, again, these are highly fragmentary individuals. The white part that you see, that's all plaster Paris. None of this was ever found. And this part of the jaw was never found. The only part of this specimen that was ever actually found was this part back here, the occipital bone, which is the back of your skull. Part of the mandibular remains right up over in here, and then a third lower jaw that you see down here in blue. So the part in light green, the part in up here, the upper mandible, and the part that's down here, the lower jaw, are the only three real parts. Notice that none of those parts articulate together. As it turned out, during the course of my discovery, I determined that this bone here is indeed human. It is from Homo sapiens. But the upper mandibular remains are that of an orang jaw. And then there's an entirely third specimen that has no relationship to these other. This reconstruction is based on the assumption that evolution were true. And it's still in the textbooks to this day. Many scientists, evolutionists, don't realize this is absolutely a complete faulty reconstruction. This is an example of what I was saying, where based on the bias of the paleontologists, this reconstruction was done. I did publish a paper on this, pointing out the fallacious reconstruction, and that occurs in the Creation Research Society Quarterly. At that time, I was a graduate student, so I published it under a pen name. Now, one last slide. So we're about done. I know, a lot of information. I slammed you against the wall. I do that to my students every day here at the Master's College. So they've got used to it. Chimp and human DNA. You know, this is, you see these debates that go on ad nauseum, and the evolutionists always pop up and say, oh, well, the one thing you can't refute is the similarities between human DNA and chimp DNA. That shows a common ancestor. So they say, essentially, that there's about 97% similarity. Well, that number is highly disputed. There's a lot of information and evidence that the number is far lower, but let's just assume that that number is accurate for the sake of argument. Here's what Jonathan Sarfati says about that. A point often overlooked is the vast differences between different kinds of creatures. Every creature has an encyclopedic information content. So even a